Hi, I'm Osama, and today I'll be presenting the work I've done with my advisor, Dr. Padmini Srinivasan, on sensorial style. Let's imagine that you and your friend are out camping and you come across a unicorn. You look to your friend and say, "It's so beautiful." And if your friend was Agnes from the movie Despicable Me, she might say, "You don't love me!" Let's try to understand what just happened here. Consider that when we interact with the world, we use our senses. These senses can include the traditional five senses: touch, taste, sight, smell, and feel, and a sixth one, interoception, the perception of sensation from within the body, like hunger and pain, and fear and joy. Now, we can use language to encode the sensorial space around us. In this particular example, you had used a visual word, beautiful, to describe the unicorn, while Agnes had used the haptic word, fluffy. This might just have been Agnes's quirk, or it might be that she just has a propensity to use more haptic language to describe visual concepts. If we were to analyze Agnes's language and discover that she has a preference for haptic language, we can say that it's part of her sensorial style. If you're like me, you might have found Agnes's particular usage a bit odd. This is because you might think that unicorns should be described visually, but Agnes instead used haptic language. Her replacement of one sense for another subverted our initial expectation. This means that if we have any sensorial utterance, there's a modality that we expect to co-occur with it. We can measure how people's actual usage differs or aligns with this expectation to represent sensorial style. Let's say I take a bunch of sentences with visual language and I blank out all the sensorial words. I can now ask you to fill in the blanks and record the distribution of the sensorial modalities of the words you use. From this, I can calculate a ratio of the modality given that the original sense was visual. Since you can choose from any of the 6 senses, using this process I would have 6 ratios for the given visual modality. If you're more like Agnes, you might have a higher ratio of haptic words. We can repeat this process for the other 5 senses, representing each one of them as a 6-dimensional vector of ratios. It might be that you're using sensorial language in instances where we wouldn't expect any. We include a 7th vector to capture this idea. We are able to represent sensorial style using this 42-dimensional vector of ratios capturing synesthesia. So far, we have been relying on 2 assumptions. Number 1, we can somehow know the sense of each word, and number 2, we can somehow know what the expected modality is. For the first part, we make use of the sensory motor norm lexicon, which has around 40,000 concepts. Given that the average adult lexicon is around 42,000 words, in comparison 40,000 is quite big. In our paper, we go into details about how we are using this lexicon to assign a sense to each one of the words. For the second part, we leverage a large masked language model like Meta's Roberta. These language models have been pre-trained on a large and diverse set of language data and thus have learned the norms of the language. Given any input sentence, we expect Roberta to make use of the pre-trained norms to fill in the blank. We use the sensory motor lexicon to assign each one of the predicted words its relevant sense. The sense with the highest aggregate confidence is considered to be the expected modality. Now that we have formulated a representation of sensorial style and have dealt with all the assumptions, we can now move to our main investigation and ask our research questions. We first want to know whether this representation is arbitrary or because of a deliberate choice. If your usage of sensorial language is independent of the underlying expected modalities, we can argue that your sensorial style is arbitrary. Otherwise, we can consider it a product of deliberate choice. We consider the distribution of the senses we observed in your language. If there is independence, we expect to observe a similar distribution across your usage regardless of the actual modality. We take a bunch of sentences and instead of having you fill in the blank, we fill in the blank using the distribution we had observed earlier. Using this, we recalculate your stylistic representations. We can repeat this process multiple times to generate different permutations of these randomly generated representations. If your style is not deliberate, it should be similar to these randomly generated representations. In our paper, we used the data from 3 different sources to answer this question. These were domestic romance novels, music lyrics, and poetry. we found that the sensorial style vectors of 90% of the authors in the novel and lyric datasets were closer to non-random. However, for the poetry dataset, this number was much lower and closer to just 23%. Digging a little deeper, we found that poets whose representation was non-random had on average used 159 sensorial sentences in their writing, while those whose representation appeared to be random had on average 24 sense-focused sentences. This raises an interesting question. It seems sensorial style might be dependent on size. And if you think about it, it makes sense. I can't get a good understanding of your sensorial style if you just gave me 1 or 2 examples of your language use. And instead, I would need a little bit more data. But how much data is enough? Next, we try to answer this question. If I want to know whether your sensorial style becomes stable in 10 sentences, what I can do is randomly take a set of 10 sentences from your language use and calculate a representation of this random sample. I can now repeat this process multiple times to get multiple representations of sensorial style. We can then calculate the similarity between all these vectors coming from the random set of 10 sentences each. If your style indeed becomes stable in just 10 sentences, then we would expect that the similarity wouldn't increase a lot if we had increased our sample size to 11, 12, or 100 sentences. We performed this experiment on the authors in the 3 datasets, starting from a sample of a single sentence going all the way to 1,000. We found that we needed between 100 to 200 sentences to get a stable representation of the novels and music lyrics. However, the style of poetry didn't stabilize even after 400 sentences. This might explain our results from the previous question. Besides these 2 questions, in our work we also looked at how sensorial style varies over time. We found that the average similarity of the songs within the lyrics dataset had decreased between 1963 to today. However, this decrease was quite small. For the 3 genres, we also looked at what features make individuals distinctive and representative. I won't go into the details of the methods here for these 2 questions. You can find those in our paper. In our paper, we also look at how good sensorial style is at genre prediction. The key contribution of our paper is the representation of sensorial style. In the absence of prior literature in the domain, the questions we ask intend to give us a deeper understanding of the style of the senses. We did not know a priori whether this style is deliberate and how this style varied with time. Similarly, in the absence of prior work, we also did not know how much data is needed to represent this. We have just taken the first step towards investigating sensorial style. We hope that future research can build up on this foundation and advance the field further.